Yes. So, hello, welcome to the second lecture as such in this accelerator and beam physics course. Basically, we'll be looking at a historical overview today on accelerators. After this, I will be circulating two tutorial sheets. There is no order of preference which one you need to do first, but anyway, you can do it sequentially. And that will be our occupation for next couple of sessions. That is next week, Tuesday and Friday. We'll be looking at the tutorial problems. Uh, Tutorial problems are of moderate difficulty level, so please try to discuss it mutually. Please try to solve it over the weekend. You can use that time for that. Okay, so that when we meet on Tuesday, you will be in a good position. As soon as the lecture is over, after that I'll circulate the tutorial sheet. Okay. Anyway, coming to our historical overview on accelerators, the means in any history of accelerators, one of the first names which comes to mind is Rutherford. Rutherford, of course, became extremely famous with the alpha scattering experiment, in which he observed that there can be extremely large deviations of the alpha particles from a radioactive source. And this is just an experimental depiction of that experiment. However, after doing radioactive beam based scattering research for a few years, Rutherford realized that basically what he was sensing, even though he didn't, there was no quantum mechanics at that time, he realized that what he was sensing is the uh, region near the nucleus. And he already uh, realized that you need more energetic particles if you want to probe the nature of the atoms in a more in-depth manner. And in fact, in the 1920s, when he was the president of the Royal Society in England, he actually gave this kind of open challenge. He said that uh, we need a positive ion source, or a source of positive particles which have much higher energy than what you get from natural radioactive substances, that is natural alpha particles. And he gave this as a kind of open challenge, and this was quite widely publicized, that um, the need to develop particle accelerators as the next stage for nuclear physics, or in general atomic and nuclear physics, to understand the structure of atom and structure of the nucleus. This understanding was there even prior to quantum mechanics. Of course, by the time this uh, Rutherford gave this speech, already quantum mechanics was in development, and the concept of de Broglie wavelength, etc., was there somewhere. But the primary motivation from Rutherford side was a empirical consideration, that he just realized that you need higher energy particles than what you are getting from a natural radioactive source. And when Rutherford gave this challenge, a number of people tried to meet this challenge, and that is the primary starting point of our history. Basically, development started in the 1930s, which is dominated by DC accelerators. A DC accelerator is a very simple object. You basically have a very high voltage source, and you have a particle source or ion source which is raised on that high voltage. And the other end of the beam line is kept at ground potential, and you have a target on which these particles will come and fall. As you know, if you have a high voltage on one side and a ground potential at the other side, you will have an electric field in the direction from the higher to lower voltage. And so any particle which is produced here will immediately get accelerated by this electric field and hit the target with a very high energy. Total energy of the particle will be charge of the particle multiplied by the voltage which you have. And so the whole game was how to produce extremely large voltages. If you are able to produce and sustain extremely large voltages, then you will get extremely energetic beams. This was the primary idea. And basically from this primary idea, there we can follow two chains of development. One type of development was made by a basically a Dutch engineer by name of Van de Graaff. Van de Graaff was actually based in America, but he was visiting England when Rutherford made his announcement, and so he had this motivation that yeah, maybe this is something which I can do. He was basically an electrical engineer. This was Van de Graaff who got inspired by Rutherford's idea. The other is a group of two people. That is, the other development was by Cockcroft and Walton. Cockcroft and Walton were basically employees at uh, the Cavendish laboratory when Rutherford was the director there, and so they had direct interaction with Rutherford, and they decided to work on this concept of getting high voltages. So the DC accelerator era was dominated by two developments. One was the Van de Graaff generator or Van de Graaff accelerator, and other was the Cockcroft-Walton generator. We'll look at these two things one by one. First, let us have a look at the Van de Graaff generator. Van de Graaff designed and first operated this kind of generator in the 1931 or so. Um and the concept which Van de Graaff used, see, basically what you want is to produce a high voltage. That is the aim. What Van de Graaff then did was, he said, if I want to produce a high voltage, I need to populate a lot of charge at one place, so that that place will be having very high positive potential, and then with respect to ground, that can be at a very high voltage. So what Van de Graaff did was, he took a belt made of some canvas type material, basically an insulator material, which is also quite rugged, and you can construct it into a belt type of thing. And then he took an ordinary voltage source and induced some charge on the insulating surface. And then he made this belt through a motor. He was running the belt upstairs, so that basically it is like a conveyor belt, you put charge at this end and you pick it up at the other end. The mechanism of generating the charge and picking up the charge is through some needles which are, or some kind of comb arrangement which is touching this canvas belt. This is similar to if you rub a cloth against certain materials, you get static charge. Exactly the same thing. He generated static charge on the canvas belt, and that static charge was picked up by few needles which were touching the belt at the upper end, so that very soon this region becomes highly positively charged. And then if you connect that to your ion source, the ion source is at a very high potential compared to the ground, and so your beam gets accelerated in the downward direction. This is the basic concept of a Van de Graaff type generator. Namely, you actually physically transport the charges from a ground potential to another point, and that point gradually accumulates charges and becomes highly positively charged. This is the basic concept, and this basic concept is used even today in all particle accelerators, as not all, but most particle accelerators, as a starting point. The initial beam acceleration is always through a Van de Graaff or a Cockcroft-Walton, one of these. So Van de Graaff is one of the popular options which still is there in current day uh, pre-accelerators. But there are many accelerators worldwide which are just pure Van de Graaff generators, which are used as nuclear physics or atomic physics research accelerators, or materials, ion implantation, everything. It is one of the simplest things to work. A small disadvantage is that it has moving parts, so you will have to continuously keep monitoring that so that it doesn't deteriorate. Whenever there are moving parts, then maintenance costs, etc., automatically come in. Uh, Another picture of a Van de Graaff generator. Right now, I would like you to concentrate only at the top part. Imagine that there is an ion source here, and you can see that there is a belt at the center which is red and yellow in color. And as the belt moves and charges this high voltage dome, the charged particles which are produced there, they get accelerated downwards. Acceleration in this picture is indicated by the increasing distance between the dots, and so you get a highly accelerated beam coming out. This concept is actually slightly more complex than that. People came up with an additional improvement on Van de Graaff's design. Basically, in original Van de Graaff generator, you have an ion source at high voltage which produces positive ions, and since the high voltage is also positive, that repels and accelerates in the downward direction. But some people decided that we can do one step better. We can use, since we are anyway generating high voltage here, let us use it double. So they came up with a negative ion source, and the negative ion source is kept at ground potential, so that those ions, when they reach here, they get attracted by the positive terminal, and so they get accelerated in the upward direction. That is the first stage of acceleration. And at the accelerator, there is something called a stripper arrangement, which basically removes electrons from the negative ion, converts it into a positive ion. So now that that ion is positive, the positive ion again accelerates in the downward direction. So you get basically what you call ek tir mein do nishan type of thing. You get acceleration going up and coming down, because you are clever enough to start with a negative ion. So the negative ion gets accelerated while going up, and then once it hits a stripper kind of arrangement, it loses electrons, it converts into a positive ion, and that positive ion again accelerates. This kind of arrangement is called a tandem accelerator or tandem Van de Graaff accelerator. Tandem meaning you must have seen this kind of photograph of this cycle which two people can ride sitting one behind the other. That kind of cycle is called a tandem cycle, two people working together on the same thing. So here basically the it is like double acceleration is possible because you utilize the high voltage both on the way up and on the way down. We'll be discussing this point in more detail when we come to some of the specific accelerator types, but this was just an overview that this idea is also there. Another idea which people came up with, which improved the efficiency of these Van de Graaff machines, is that instead of a canvas belt, they divided into a chain of beads. Each bead is a metallic bead, but they are connected by an insulator. How this helps? This, imagine this like a cycle chain. Each link of the chain is a metal, but just in the case of the accelerator type which we are discussing, the link between the metal beads is through a insulating material, a polymer material. The advantage of this is that when you are inducing the charge on the metal bead, the charge spreads out uniformly, and this gives you much better stability. Also, it gives you the capacity to transport much larger volumes of charge. So this kind of development was called Pelletron. It's a brand name. Pelletron meaning it's an accelerator with the belt made up of pellets of metal, and the Pelletron was able to achieve much higher stability and much higher voltages than a ordinary Van de Graaff, because of the added advantage that since it is a metal pellet, you can deposit more charge on it, and the charge transfer mechanisms are also more robust, so that you get better stability and higher energy. So with the Pelletron and tandem concept together, this is for example TIFR Pelletron accelerator is basically a tandem Van de Graaff, but it's a tandem Pelletron type accelerator. Same thing with the folded tandem ion accelerator at BRC, which is called FOTIA. FOTIA is just short for folded tandem ion accelerator. Okay. So all these accelerators are basically DC accelerators. They are Van de Graaff type. Their charging system is through a pellet chain, not through a canvas belt, and they can achieve quite high energies. Okay. High meaning for TIFR Pelletron, the terminal voltage is around 14 megavolt. Rated voltage is 14. Typically achieved is 11.5. And BRC FOTIA has around 6 megavolt rating, and I think they achieve routinely 4 to 5 megavolt. So this multiplied by the charge of the ion can give you energies up to 70, 80, 100 MeV easily. Okay. So these are some typical numbers for you to just have a feel for it. The advantage of the Van de Graaff is that you don't actually have a high voltage source. Your voltage source is only few kilo electron volt, or sorry, few kilovolt. But because of the charging mechanism, you can develop up to mega electron volts of voltage on the dome. Okay. The other idea which came up around the same time, as we saw that they were both inspired by Rutherford's original challenge. So the work almost started at the same time, and Cockcroft and Walton finished the development in around 1932 when they demonstrated for the first time this kind of accelerator. The principle of a Cockcroft-Walton generator is again very simple. Basically, it consists of an AC source along with a diode and capacitor arrangement, which is shown in the figure. So just to understand this particular figure or this particular circuit, imagine that the AC source, which is on the left, you start off with the positive half cycle such that the lower terminal is at plus voltage and the upper terminal is at minus voltage. Then basically you can see that the current will flow from the lower arm of the circuit and it will flow through the diode because the capacitor number 2 is blocking the current in this horizontal direction. So it will pass through the diode and then charge the capacitor number 1. So in one half cycle the capacitor number 1 charges completely. After that, when you come to the negative half cycle, what happens? The capacitor number 1 starts to discharge, but while discharging it cannot discharge because this particular capacitor is reverse biased. So sorry, diode is reverse biased, so it will discharge through the diode number 2, and therefore while capacitor number 1 is discharging, capacitor number 2 charges up. Then again in the positive half cycle, through the diode number 1, capacitor 1 will charge again, but at that time capacitor number 2 will discharge and partially charge up capacitor number 3. Then in the next half cycle again 1 replenishes the charge of 2 and 3 then shares its charge with 4. Then in next half cycle again, so basically gradually you are transferring charge from capacitor 1 to 2, next half cycle 2 to 3, next half cycle 3 to 4, till a situation arises where each of the capacitors is fully charged to the uh, full height of this particular AC waveform, because gradually they'll keep charging, and when that happens, the total voltage between ground and this point will be the sum total of all the capacitors in that path. You can in principle extend this kind of arrangement to very large number of capacitors and diodes, and so again if you have suppose 100 such capacitors and diodes arrangement, if you have an initial voltage source of 20 kilovolts, your final voltage at this point, DC voltage, addition of each capacitor will be around 1 million volts. So with a again the same concept that with a 20 kilovolt or 10 kilovolt AC supply, you can achieve a DC voltage of around megavolts range. It depends on number of capacitors and diodes which you are actually connecting. Okay. This is an actual Cockcroft-Walton accelerator. This is the ion source. These are just insulating columns to support the ion source, and this is the Cockcroft-Walton type of generator arrangement, which feeds the high voltage to this particular deck or dome. Okay. This is actually a picture from Fermi Lab, Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory in the USA. Okay. One of the highest energy accelerators which we currently have. The initial stage is a Cockcroft-Walton machine of this type. There is another very nice historical picture. This is actually Cockcroft and Walton's original experimental arrangement. They were the first to actually artificially transmute a nucleus into another nucleus using a ion beam. They actually bombarded an ion beam on some heavy nucleus and transmuted it to a different element. And in fact, they got the Nobel Prize in 1951 for the first artificial transmutation done in the laboratory. The Cockcroft-Walton, generator is here. No, this is just a spark gap. The Cockcroft-Walton generator is here. This is the ion source which is connected using this cable. This is actually Walton, if I am not mistaken. And he is basically, there is this, he has a curtain for this, whatever cubicle which he has built, which he can close whenever he wants. The purpose is that there is a scintillator phosphorescent screen kept over here, so that when the ion beam comes and hits, the phosphorescent screen will glow whenever there is a transmutation, and the guy is sitting and actually taking data. He is just counting number of spots which he sees in that phosphorescent screen, and by counting such dots is how they figured out that the transmutation is taking place, and that is how they got the Nobel Prize. This is just a simple example that you don't have to have fancy equipment, you have to have fancy ideas if you want to do something in physics. Okay, these are the early days. This is like any laboratory in any institute. This is Cavendish lab in those days during Rutherford's time, and the photograph is actually, if I'm not mistaken, it is Walton who is sitting inside that. Okay, just a interesting photograph, and how they used to do experiment in those days. Very nice to see. All right. Uh, is there any doubt at this stage? You can ask, because we'll move to a completely different track now. Were you familiar with the concept of Van de Graaff generator from BSc or something? I know BSc was a long time back for you guys, but nothing. हाँ बोलो.
So we were introduced this in class 12th only.
ठीक है, that's good. That's very good. Both Cockcroft-Walton and Van de Graaff. Is it?
No, sir, only Van de Graaff.
Okay, fine. ठीक है. ठीक है, that is very good then. That's not an issue. This timeline is basically going to contain all the accelerators which we are looking in this history. But right now, the portion of the timeline related to DC accelerators is in red color. I hope on your screen also it is showing up as red color only. Uh, Basically, in 1928, Rutherford issued this challenge of making higher energy particles. And by 1931, Van de Graaff had already achieved the Van de Graaff accelerator. Of course, Van de Graaff was working, I wouldn't say in isolation, but in relative isolation. See, the hub of physics was Europe and the UK. And US was more into engineering and other things. So Van de Graaff, while he had and also he was not actually at a university per se, but he did develop the Van de Graaff accelerator. And Van de Graaff's legacy is that by the time Van de Graaff died, there were several hundred of these Van de Graaff accelerators working worldwide. So that is an achievement. Means by the time you die, if something you invented is, and something pretty huge which you invented is being used by so many groups worldwide, it's an achievement in its own right, according to me. And the concept of the Van de Graaff accelerator underwent these revisions which we discussed. The tandem accelerator concept was floated in the 50s, and the Pelletron concept came in the mid 60s. And after that, it revolutionized the kind of energies one can achieve with a Van de Graaff type of arrangement. So as I mentioned, the highest I believe with a Pelletron is around 20 megavolt terminal voltage. Cockcroft-Walton typically goes to 2 to 3 MeV max, because there is a limitation to this capacitor and diode arrangement, but that is enough for a pre-accelerator for most modern day accelerators, and it is a decent energy for any ordinary what you say, it's a decent energy for any ordinary laboratory scale accelerator. It's quite good energy actually. Okay, so these were the developments in the 1930s to 1960s as far as DC accelerators were concerned. So this is one arc of this history story, that is regarding the DC accelerators. We now move to the next uh, accelerator type. Historically, these ideas also came around the same time. Uh, if you look at the history carefully, you will see that all ideas for RF accelerators actually originated from one man. That is Rolf Widro. He was a engineer from Norway, and when he was a student, he had a few ideas which he wanted to try out. Basically, his two of his ideas, which actually finally impacted the field of accelerators in a very significant manner, are shown here in terms of his original drawings for them. Okay. So both are original drawings by Vidro. The lower one is a hand drawing, and the upper one is probably printed in his thesis, something of that kind, a master's thesis, basically project report in your language. Okay. And basically, Vidro's ideas, let us discuss them one by one. In the upper panel, what you see, he said that let me have an ion source with some kind of small acceleration over here in the left. Then when the ion beam comes out, basically what he said was, let me have these different tubes. And what is the significance of these tubes? That uh, whenever the ion beam emerges from here, there is an AC source connected here, and the connection will be such that this terminal is experiencing positive voltage. Negative voltage. Then this positively charged ion will attract towards this tube, and when it enters this tube, after that the tube will go through the negative voltage cycle, but during that time the charge particle is inside and doesn't experience any field. And by the time it re-emerges at the other side, this guy is now having the peak of the negative voltage, and this guy is positively charged, so or it is experiencing a positive half cycle. And so again the guy gets accelerated from here to here. Again, by the time he passes from this end of the tube to this end of the tube, so the time taken to go from one end of the tube to the other is equal to the half cycle of the AC wave which is being supplied. And so again, when he emerges, by that time this tube will be experiencing negative half cycle and this tube will be experiencing positive half cycle. So again he gets accelerated, and so on and so forth. The idea of Widro was, sorry, the idea of Widro was as simple as this: connect alternate tubes to the negative terminal of a AC generator, connect the other alternate tubes to the positive terminal of a AC generator, and then if you time the entry of the particle correctly, everything else takes care of itself. The particle keeps on getting accelerated. Because the particle velocity is increasing, you can see that uh, the tubes, next tubes need to be longer and longer. Okay. Because within the same half cycle of the AC wave, the particle will travel a longer distance. Okay. This was one idea by Widro. He himself developed this into a linear accelerator concept later on. But in this particular track, we will be looking at how this particular concept was also used for generating the first generation of circular accelerators. The other principle which Widro came up with is also very interesting. If you look at the diagram on the left here in the lower picture, you will see that it looks like a transformer. There is a iron core, and there is a primary coil, and there is a secondary coil. Widro's idea was, let me have the primary coil, let me have the iron core, but instead of the secondary coil, he said, let me put a vacuum tube in its place, and let me put a few free electrons into this vacuum tube. Once you do that, if you change the voltage in the primary coil, automatically electric field is induced in the secondary, and if electrons are present over there, they get accelerated. Because you know that by mutual induction, if the voltage is changing in the primary, the voltage in the secondary will also change. And so Widro, by injecting free electrons, basically have a electron filament, something which is emitting electrons by thermionic emission. He was able to achieve, or he was able to demonstrate that you will get very good acceleration of electrons in this kind of arrangement. Of course, then Vidro, that was during his master's time. After that, he joined some company and he started working, and he did develop the LINAC concept in detail. But these ideas were picked up by different people. The LINAC idea, after initial development by Vidro in the 1950s or late 1940s, after World War II, it was picked up by Alvarez. The same Vidro LINAC concept was also picked up in a very different context by Lawrence, and he managed to then invent the cyclotron, which we will try to see how that is related to the Vidro LINAC concept. And Donald Kirst took up the concept of the ray transformer. This particular diagram, it is like a transformer. It's like a voltage transformer. So Vidro had named it a ray transformer. By ray, you mean in the context of cathode rays, where electrons are called as cathode rays. So he said that this is a ray transformer. And Kirst picked up this concept, and he created the Betatron, which is another type of circular accelerator. We'll be looking at the Betatron in detail because it is very pertinent in the context of many of the things which we will be discussing during this course. Okay. So from this one man, Videro, you got two ideas. One was the Vidro LINAC and the other was the Vidro ray transformer. The LINAC concept was developed by Vidro himself and then later on by Alvarez in a different setting. The same LINAC concept was taken by Lawrence and it was basically folded into a circle, and you get the cyclotron. And the ray transformer was taken up by Kirst and he invented the Betatron. Let us examine each of these ideas one by one. And basically, the common thread for all of them is that you start by saying that I need an AC source. So you are abandoning the concept of a DC accelerator and going with the concept of a accelerator which will work on a AC source, which is a significant development because you don't need a high voltage source like a Van de Graaff or a what you say Cockcroft Walton if you are going directly for an RF acceleration cycle. Not that you don't need, but you can achieve in a very different manner in this case. Okay. Let us start by a discussion of the LINAC, linear accelerator. LINAC is short for linear accelerator, in case I didn't mention that earlier. Videro's original concept for the LINAC was, as we discussed earlier, that there will be an ion source and there will be drift tubes of increasing length. The length has to increase because the velocity of the particle is increasing. Okay. And the alternate tubes are connected to the different terminal of the AC source. Normally, these accelerators are AC, alternating current based accelerator. They are always called RF accelerator because if you are in the radio frequency region, then the size of the components turns out to be very convenient. It is typically in several tens of centimeters, 30 centimeter, 40 centimeter. If you increase the frequency, then the size of the components becomes too small and then you have fabrication issues. Uh, if the frequency is too low, the size of the components becomes too large and then you have stability and fabrication issues again. So typically all these accelerators work at RF frequency, radio frequencies. Anyway, the alternate tubes are connected to one terminal and the other tubes are connected to the other terminal, so that in every half cycle, whenever you are at the peak of one half cycle, your particle should be between the tube number 1 and 2. Then by the time it passes through tube number 2 and emerges in the gap between 2 and 3, by that time the next half cycle is going on, then therefore you again experience a positive acceleration and so on and so forth down the line. Okay. Yeah. uh, Alvarez took this idea up in the 1940s after World War II. Basically, at the end of World War II, there was a big boost in accelerators because a lot of RF technology became available on the common market because a lot of radar equipment had been developed during the war. And after the end of the war, all this radar equipment was lying unused. So physicists basically took over that radar equipment and started developing instruments which will work on that principle. And one of the early such successes was the Alvarez LINAC. What Alvarez did was he took the same concept of drift tubes, except that in the Alvarez LINAC, all the drift tubes are connected to only one terminal, and the whole larger tube in which all of them are contained basically acts like a resonant cavity or waveguide, so that a permanent electric field is set up along the axis of this, and this electric field will be alternating in nature. So sometimes it is pointing in the right direction, sometimes in the left direction, and whenever the field is pointing in the right direction, the particle is between the gap between two drift tubes. Whenever the field is pointing in the left direction, it is inside one of the tubes and shielded from the electric field. So basically similar concept, but in this case every full cycle, the positive half cycle the particle spends in the gap, and the complete negative half cycle it spends inside the drift tube. But otherwise the working of the Alvarez LINAC is very similar to the Widro LINAC. You can see the idea that the drift tubes have to be longer and longer because as the particle accelerates, its velocity increases, so that for the same time period it will traverse a larger distance. So even in modern day context, many accelerators in the, especially in the pre-acceleration section, when they have to give initial energy to the particle, Widro and Alvarez type LINACs are used, and quite widely used in fact, and form a major component of even modern day accelerators. Alvarez type LINACs can work even in much different roles also. And a further development which is in along similar grounds as the Alvarez LINAC is the RF cavity, which is the primary accelerating mechanism for large circular accelerators. Alvarez got the Nobel Prize in 1968, probably not exclusively related to his developments in accelerators. He was into many things, but just to point out that he's a Nobel laureate. So basically, the LINAC story goes this way, that the Widro LINAC was developed, or at least the concept was floated in 1928 by Widro, and he made a very crude working model of it during his master's thesis. And then Widro developed the LINACs from 1928 onwards, wherever he worked. Alvarez took up this concept in a revised mode in 1946 and invented the Alvarez type LINAC. And in 1950s, there was a new development called alternate gradient focusing or strong focusing, which will come up as a part of a different context in our today's discussion. But in 1970s, a group in Russia actually merged the concept of strong focusing and the Alvarez LINAC together to form a instrument or a component called the radio frequency quadrupole. We'll be coming to this towards the end of the lecture. It's a modern day injector kind of thing which can accelerate, focus, and bunch any given ion beam. So it's a very versatile and useful piece of equipment. We'll be discussing this probably towards the end of today's discussion. Okay, but basically you have these ideas which run through 1928 through 1950s and then ultimately ending up near 1970 for the last major development in the context of linear accelerators. Of course, linear accelerator development even today keeps happening because superconductivity also came into the picture around 1970s 80s in a large way, and superconducting structures have some very good properties compared to normal structures, and those can be even today active research is going on to improve the efficiency of acceleration in such structures. Okay, we'll be seeing some of this during the course. All right. Uh, the next track, which we started from Videro's original LINAC concept, is the cyclotron, which was primarily developed by Ernest Orlando Lawrence, one of the big names in the American accelerator community. Cyclotron, I am sure you must have come across during your BSc. Before we go into this, is there any doubt or something or some comment or something on the LINAC part? I forgot to ask. All right, I think we'll move ahead then. Uh, this is a basic diagram of a cyclotron. You must be very familiar with this. Basically, you have a vertical magnetic field and two D-shaped electrodes, ion source at the center, and the motion of the particle is in increasing radius circles, more or less. And at the outermost circle, probably it can be deflected outwards to give a beam in a desired direction. This is the basic construction of the cyclotron. You must have done this in earlier classes. The cyclotron is an RF accelerator, and Lawrence was originally convinced of this idea, or he came up with this idea after looking at Videro's work on the Videro LINAC. He said that this LINAC is a long thing, and in fact, Lawrence's group did build a LINAC of 7 or 8 drift tubes at some stage. But then he said, if I try to warp this into a circle, then he ended up with this concept. He said, then this is what I'll end up with, and this also makes sense. Let us try it out. And he and his student Livingston, they tried it out, and it worked. And in fact, it led to a Nobel Prize down the line for Lawrence. This is the first cyclotron in Lawrence's laboratory. So you can see that this is the magnetic coil, and then the cyclotron chamber is somewhere here in between this. So again, I would like to point out the general messiness of the lab. That is fine, but the thing is, things have to work, and they did. That is why they got the Nobel Prize, of course. See, Nobel Prize is one thing, but all of these were really serious developments in the history of accelerators. This is a slightly bigger size. So Lawrence, during his career, he built something like 7 or 8 larger and larger cyclotrons. This is one of those. It's an interesting picture because Lawrence is here. And in this picture, there are others. For example, this guy sitting on top of the magnet. This is the electromagnet, by the way. This is the yoke of the magnet. And this is the coil. This and this is the upper coil, lower coil. And the cyclotron is the chamber sitting at the center. It's a huge machine, this one. This guy sitting on top of the magnet is Alvarez, whom we met in the context of the LINAC. He was also part of Lawrence's group at that particular time. The person sitting on top of this beamline is actually Edwin Macmillan. He was another person who had a great influence on the working of the accelerator. Macmillan was the one, for example, who figured out how to get good focusing in a cyclotron by adding some metal sheets between the D's and the magnet. It was interesting discovery, and they got very good focusing in the cyclotron so that the beam remained stable, and they could do a number of interesting nuclear physics experiments. Macmillan also had other contributions which will come downstream in this talk. Okay. This is an even bigger cyclotron. You can see the size. This is the iron yoke, and this is the upper magnetic pole and the lower magnetic pole, and this is the coil, probably consisting of probably thousands of turns. Okay. And this was the cyclotron. This is only the magnet. The cyclotron actual cyclotron itself is missing, probably removed for repair or something. Anyway, they probably removed it just to take this photograph. This was the machine which was used to separate the radioisotopes for creating the nuclear bomb which ended the Second World War. And you can in fact see, I don't know where Lawrence is in this whole picture. I'm not sure that he's even there. He should be there, probably this one anyway. But you can see here in the middle, there is a person from the military with the military cap and so on. So this was a civilian plus military kind of achievement. This is the largest cyclotron which was built during Lawrence's time. Even in the modern day context for nuclear physics, cyclotrons remain a very important tool, and there are many universities and institutes currently in the world who have very large cyclotron type of accelerators for their regular nuclear physics work. Okay, this was the basic legacy of Ernest Orlando Lawrence. And in fact, two of the major laboratories in the US are also named after Lawrence. Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, that is in Berkeley, and Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Both are named after Lawrence, one of the biggest names in accelerator physics in the US. Okay. And of course, Lawrence won the Nobel Prize in 1939 for inventing the cyclotron. In fact, Livingston, who was himself a big name in accelerators and who was Lawrence's student at that time, he had once joked that I and Lawrence together invented the cyclotron, and what did we get? My boss got the Nobel Prize and I got only PhD for that. I mean, that was his joke, that it was his PhD work to create the cyclotron. So he used to joke that way. Based on these developments of the cyclotron, in Russia, there was a physicist, Vladimir Wexler. Wexler came up with a variant idea of the cyclotron. Basically, in the cyclotron, you have these two D-shaped electrodes connected to a AC source. What Wexler did was he got rid of those two D-shaped electrodes and replaced it by one single object called a RF cavity, radio frequency cavity, which is basically a AC type of box with a AC electric field. So if the particle enters the box when the electric field is pointing in a particular direction, it will get accelerated. So he came up with a condition on how to keep accelerating the particle multiple times. So basically these round object or these two D-shaped objects are magnets, and the RF cavity is here, and you can see how the energy of the particle keeps increasing, and at the final turn the particle can be ejected. So this is like a cyclotron, except that instead of two complete D-shaped electrodes, you just have one small radio frequency cavity at the center, and that does the same kind of task as you had for the cyclotron. The advantage is that you can have a series of cavities, or you can have an entire LINAC over here, so that you can get much larger boosts in energy. And one of the largest microtrons for electron acceleration, this is a picture of that. This is from a group in France, and basically you can get extremely high energies of electrons from this kind of arrangement. By the way, the cyclotron doesn't work very well for electrons because the condition for stability in the cyclotron is a non-relativistic condition. So for relativistic particles like the electron, that somehow breaks down. But the microtron doesn't suffer from this problem. So you can actually keep on re-accelerating the electron beam through the microtron. And so it's a popular choice for an electron accelerator. Well, not exactly popular, but it's a viable choice for the electron acceleration. The popular choice for electron acceleration is just a plain LINAC. But if you are looking for a compact source, then this is one of the very good options for that. Okay. The third track starting from Widrow was when Widrow had introduced this concept of a ray transformer. This is a more clearer picture of Widrow's old drawing. where you can clearly see that there is a primary winding coil and the secondary coil is replaced by an electron tube. So if you inject electrons into this and at the same time you pass a changing voltage through the primary coil, then there will be a changing voltage here which will accelerate the electrons and you get highly energetic electrons coming out. This concept was taken up by Kirst when he built the Betatron. And Kirst also during his career, he built 5 or 6 larger and larger Betatron accelerators. And the limitation on the size of the Betatron came about because the amount of iron required was too large. Because basically, as you increase the current through these primary windings, this uh, the ferromagnetic what you say permeability of this is not sufficient and part of the magnetic field lines may leak out. So if that happens, then you need a larger iron core to handle that, and there is a size limitation on the amount of iron which you can use. The largest Betatron which they built had something like 200 tons or so of iron. Very very huge object. Okay. This picture is of a modern day Betatron which can be very very compact with suitable magnet technologies, and these compact sources are used in many ways for flaw detection, non-destructive testing, etc. Applications where you need a compact but powerful and high energy source of electrons. The object on the left is the actual Betatron, the object on the right is the power supply, and the middle object is the control unit. And these can be commercially available for various types of applications. Okay. This is about the Betatron. After all these concepts came up, another important development took place, which was the development of the synchrotron. This is a logical flow of ideas when you have developed the Betatron, the cyclotron, and the microtron. This is a natural flow of ideas. Marcus Oliphant was, if I am not mistaken, an Australian physicist who was working at various places around the world, and he came up with the basic idea for a synchrotron in the 1930s or early 1940s, towards the end of World War II. Basically, the idea of a synchrotron is to take several of the ideas which you have seen before and actually use them together. This is the layout of a modern synchrotron facility. Okay. So basically what Oliphant said was, what you need is a accelerating cavity like you have in the microtron. But in the microtron, you have only 2 magnets, one at this corner and one at this corner. Instead of that, Oliphant said, let us have several small magnets which bend by small angles, so that the beam keeps on traveling like this, travel, again reaccelerate in the accelerating cavity with higher energy, then travel, again accelerate, again higher energy, again travel, and so on. So basically, every time the particle gains a kick from here, at that time the magnetic field of all these magnets has to be adjusted such that the radius remains constant. You know that the radius of a particle in a magnetic field can be given by uh, usual uniform circular motion kind of formula. We'll be looking at a version of this formula at some stage called the rigidity formula. But basically, you know how to calculate for uniform circular motion. Basically, centripetal force is provided by the magnetic Lorentz force. So you can compare that and obtain an expression for this. So basically, what Oliphant's idea was that the magnetic field value keeps on adjusting itself, so that for the current energy of the beam, the magnet always bends the beam through the same path. So by the time the beam makes it back and reaccelerates, this magnetic field has already adjusted itself for the new value of the energy, and so on and so forth. This was Oliphant's basic idea. This is like separating out the functions of acceleration and uh, recirculation, that is bending of the beam. The bending is achieved using magnets, and the acceleration is achieved using an accelerating cavity. And you have to, of course, take care of some condition whereby always the particle comes back to the accelerating cavity in phase with the electric field inside the cavity, so that it always continues to get accelerated and does not randomly get accelerated and decelerated. So those conditions still have to be met, but this actually in principle enables you to make as large an accelerator as you wish, because you can keep on increasing the number of magnets, reducing their curvature, that is increasing their radius of curvature, and you will get larger and larger magnets. This is the de facto layout for a modern day large accelerator. All modern day large accelerators are synchrotrons. Another important concept is that in this picture you can see this second type of magnet called a focusing magnet, which is basically a quadrupole magnet. It has two north and two south poles instead of an ordinary magnet which has a north and south pole. So we'll come to this concept at some stage. Another thing I would like you to notice here is that many times the magnet layout can be such that the iron part is only in a C shape and the outer part is nothing here. This is fine because you can always draw an Amperian loop through this and try to calculate the magnetic field. But I just want to point out this C shape because there is an interesting story related to this down the line. In the 1950s or late 40s and early 50s, development of the synchrotron took place, and General Electric was one of the first to actually build a synchrotron based on Oliphant's design. Oliphant himself could not manage to get funds to build a synchrotron till 1958 or so. So even though he gave the idea, he is not the first person to actually build it. It was one of the first was built by General Electric, not the first, but one of the first. And they had used a vacuum tube which is made of glass. And as you can see, when the electron beam was circulated through this, very bright light was observed coming from the tube. And this is how synchrotron radiation was discovered. Synchrotron radiation came to play a very, very major role in modern day context of variety of phenomena. Okay. So anything for which you need a laser or some kind of light, you can do that with a synchrotron facility, right from microwave region up to even gamma ray region. Any type of electromagnetic radiation you need can be extracted from a synchrotron facility. Sorry. Okay. So these are some of the ideas associated with the synchrotron. This is another picture of a very famous early design synchrotron called the Cosmotron, which was built in the USA. You can see that this is in fact taken from a advertisement by some company. They said that we are supplying the coil for this and so on. This is the coil, by the way, for one of the magnets. Okay, so we'll come to a very interesting story about the Cosmotron, but these were the basic initial developments in the accelerator type, which is called as synchrotron. So now if you look back at your timeline where you have reached, all kinds of circular accelerators. Lorentz and Lewington started with the concept of the cyclotron. Wexler modified this concept to design the microtron, and Oliphant around the same time got the idea for the synchrotron. Goward and Barnes were the first to actually demonstrate this. Goward and Barnes did a very clever thing. They said the synchrotron thing which Oliphant is trying to float, they had an old Betatron in their lab. So they just removed the Betatron chamber and then they tried out the synchrotron idea on that by introducing a new vacuum tube. And they found that this works. So they said, yeah, Oliphant is right. His idea works. And then actual developments took place much later. General Electric, as we said, first developed the first. It was an accidental discovery actually, because they had a glass vacuum tube. They realized a lot of light is coming. I mean, I don't know what the story is, but I can imagine someone switches the machine on and someone sees and are light are ruko ruko. what is going on, and they must have had this kind of moment definitely, because like, why is light coming out from the tube, because there is nothing from our side. But later they realized that it is a physical phenomena of the electron beam radiating electromagnetic radiation. Very interesting. And then to continue that line further, in 1970s, Maddie actually came up with this idea of something called the free electron laser, which is basically a synchrotron facility gives you a broadband electromagnetic spectrum. Maddie came up with a way to actually force this electromagnetic radiation to come out at a fixed coherent wavelength, and that came to be known as the free electron laser. We'll have a brief look at this towards the end of today's discussion. Okay, but the timeline items which are in blue are related to the betatron, and the ones in orange are related to cyclotron, and then gradually microtron and synchrotron, all circular accelerators other than the betatron. The distinction is because the betatron is the only accelerator which relies on electromagnetic induction, that is Faraday's law of induction, as a method of accelerating the particle. All the other circular accelerators are extensions of a same concept, that is AC acceleration. You either have a AC source or a RF cavity which is in turn powered by an AC source, but it is always AC. The betatron is special because there the idea is more related to electromagnetic induction than a direct AC source being involved. Okay. All right. At this point, again, I would like to pause and ask if there are some questions, comments from your side. Please. Sorry. Hello. Anything from your side? Yeah, sorry about that. I'm back. If there is nothing, then let us move forward. The next two important developments which took place somewhere in the 1950s and 1960s, which revolutionized the modern day um, operation of accelerators. One of these concepts was the concept of phase stability. This is a very interesting and very important concept. So I would like you to pay particular attention here. We'll of course be doing this again in class. I mean, in an actual Blackboard type lecture, but it's good to have your attention at this point. Basically, the arguments which led to the consideration of phase stability is the following. Suppose you have a AC wave like what is depicted in this picture, and you have a charged particle whom you want to accelerate, and you can choose the time at which the particle actually enters the region of this electric field. Then your common sense will tell you that the particle should arrive when the peak of the electric field is going on, because naturally this will allow you to have maximum acceleration. Is that okay? Does that make sense? If I want to use an AC wave to accelerate a particle, then the particle should enter the region of that electric field uh, when the electric field is at its peak value. Does this make sense? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a reasonable thing to imagine that since it is not DC, it is AC. So AC का value जब maximum रहेगा तभी particle should interact with that particular accelerator. So imagine a small box inside which the field is sometimes pointing this way and sometimes pointing this way. It is sinusoidally oscillating. I hope you can see my video, otherwise you will not understand what I'm saying. So sometimes it is pointing this way, sometimes it is pointing this way, and if that happens, then you want the particle to enter the region when it is acting, the field is acting in the direction which you want to accelerate it. Okay. Wexler and Macmillan, both of them actually came to the realization that this is actually not a good idea, making the particle enter that region when the field is at its maximum. Their argument was we should choose one particular value of the voltage which correspond to some particular phase of the voltage waveform. If the waveform is sine of omega t plus phi naught, then you choose a phase phi naught, such that if it is sine omega t, then you choose omega t equal to phi naught. The particle should enter the region of electric field when the value of the electric field is at this particular point, or value of the voltage is at this particular point. Their reasoning behind this is extremely important, so pay attention carefully. Let me try to draw on this so that we can probably get a better idea. So Wexler and Macmillan argue that your particle should enter the electric field when the voltage is at this particular value. Okay? Not this. So they are saying don't do this. They are saying do this. Why? The argument of Wexler and Macmillan is that suppose you have a beam of particles, then all the particles, so you have a beam of particles, all the particles are not moving with the same velocity. Some of them have slightly slower velocity, some of them have slightly far. Slight means very slight, but still it is there. Okay? Means if the mean velocity of the beam is, let us say, 0.8 times velocity of light, then there may be a spread of 0.01 times velocity of light, plus or minus. That kind of thing is always possible. So if a particular particle is moving faster than the other particles, what will happen to him? He will arrive a little early. Early means earlier in time. When he arrives a little early, what happens to him? He gains slightly less energy during this particular round of acceleration. If a particle is a little slow, he arrives a little late. And he will achieve slightly higher energy in this particular round of acceleration. So basically, if a particle is too fast, in this round, he gains less energy so that he will then gradually catch up with the mean velocity. If a particular particle is too slow, then he arrives late, he gains more energy, and therefore he can gradually catch up with the other particles who are moving at a higher velocity. So basically, Wexler and Macmillan argued that if you choose some phase for the average energy particle, average energy of the bunch, if you choose a particular time of arrival, then all the remaining particles also arrive early and late. They remain bounded to move along with this mean particle, because the ones who are slower get speeded up a little, the ones who are faster get slowed down a little, so that all of them will continue to move together and you will not lose out any particles in the process. On the other hand, if you try out for this particular scenario where you make the mean particle arrive here, then any particle who arrives a little late will actually gain less energy, and in the next round he'll arrive more late, more late, more late, and finally he'll drop out from the whole equation. This was the argument of Wexler and Macmillan, that they said that the best choice of phase of arrival of the beam is not when the half cycle is at its peak, but when the half cycle is somewhere on the rising side, so that eventually all particles remain combined together. This concept was called as phase stability. That is, if you choose a particular phase for the beam to arrive, then you will get stable transport of the beam. Whereas if you try to maximize the beam arrive, the energy gained by the beam in one revolution, you will actually not get stable transport of the whole beam. Beam particles will continue to get lost, and eventually you will get a much lower current than what you had injected into the accelerator. This is not a serious loss, because in all AC accelerators you have the luxury of recirculating the beam again and again and again, so that it passes through. You can pass any number of times, so each time, if the energy gain is small, it is fine for you, as long as you are getting all the particles accelerated eventually. Anyway, this is in recorded mode, so you can actually have a look at it later on also. Try to understand this. This is also described very nicely in Wilson's book, in Willie's book, in Edwards and Cypher's book, because it's a very important concept. You can go through all of that. If you still don't understand, anyway, we will be coming up with a discussion of this later on during uh, the discussion on beam acceleration and longitudinal dynamics. So we'll be revisiting this idea, but please try to spend time with this idea, because it's a very important concept. Any question at this stage on this concept of phase stability?
So this phase stability should be dependent on the type of the particle which are going to get accelerated, because they should have the different uh, interactions between them.
Can you elaborate on that? What do you mean they will have different interactions between them?
Means as you explain here, some particles have large means some particular accelerate means are at the front stage, some are at means they have different distribution of velocity between them, but this distribution is also dependent on the nature of the particle also. So for the each particle, each type of particle, the phase stability should be different or the same. That
Well, the velocity distributions will be different, but unless you follow this principle, you will not get stable transport, right? Because the velocities of different particles, you are talking about, let us say, for example, compare electron beam to a proton beam. The
yeah,
distribution function may be different, or the actual value of the energy spread may be different. Uh, that doesn't affect these arguments, in my opinion. Okay? Because what you are saying here is that you did not bring in the extent of the spread anywhere into the argument, right? You only involve the fact that there is a spread. You
yes,
are not substituting an explicit value for delta v or something inside this. It's right now, it's at a conceptual stage, and at the conceptual stage, all you are saying is that there is a velocity spread in the beam, and therefore I should do this to ensure that the slower guys also get an opportunity to catch up, and the faster guys don't get encouraged to keep on getting higher and higher energies. That is what you are trying to ensure. You are trying to ensure that the slower guys catch up and the faster guys slow down relative to their original speed, so that all of them keep oscillating in some sense around the mean velocity. Uh, I think when we visit these ideas further, we'll get more clarity on this. But just to add to your point, one can actually construct a phase space for these particles, and then one can invoke Liouville's theorem, that is the conservation of phase space volume. And it can be demonstrated that unless you follow this some of these phase stability conditions, your phase space volume in or the accessible region of phase space for that particular beam is not, you cannot access it completely unless you follow these conditions. We'll be coming to this, okay? So at that time we'll have a look at it. Is that okay?
okay, sir.
Yeah.
Huh, sir.
Sir,
Yeah, Faraz, bolo.
so this thing also it improves the coherence in the beam, right?
Uh, Can you define what you mean by coherence?
So coherence is kind of phase difference remains constant in the beam. So all the particles they'll come out with almost the same phase.
Right, but that the phase which you are talking about in the context of coherence is
Omega 3 plus phi.
nahi, but that is a different concept for an electromagnetic wave, and this is the phase of the AC wave at which the particle is arriving. It is not a phase associated with the particle per se.
Okay.
You're getting my point. This wave form is not the particle de Broglie wave or something. It is the waveform of the AC source.
Okay. Okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah. I personally don't feel that coherence has. I mean, coherence, as you mentioned, has anything to do with it. But you do manage to restrict the whole particle beam within a confinement of certain region of phase. And what you are saying, improving the coherence, uh, means reducing the spread in the phase.
Yeah.
There are mechanisms to do that, but this doesn't do that, because here what will happen is, eventually, the if you keep going at this, the particles which were slower now will become faster particles later on. The particles which are faster now will become slower particles later on, but you don't reduce the spread in phase at any point of time.
Okay.
Okay, you just maintain the spread in phase and don't allow it to increase. That's what is achieved in this context. There are ways to reduce the phase space spread that would be counted as probably improving the coherence, but we'll come to that at a later stage in the course. The process for doing that is something called beam cooling. If you want, you can read up about it. I've given you the name of the topic. Okay?
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, welcome. uh, this is one important concept which came in the 1950s, and this helped to achieve stable transport of larger and larger currents, in especially in synchrotrons which were being developed at that stage, which had a great impact, because if you can achieve larger currents, you can probe much rarer phenomena by interacting those particles with the systems which you want to interact them with. Okay. The other important concept which came up somewhere around the same time, around 1960s, this one was a concept called alternate gradient focusing, and this is another discovery by accident. So you see, after Oliphant put in the idea of synchrotron, a number of accidental discoveries were made. One of the accidental discoveries we discussed was the General Electric synchrotron giving out synchrotron radiation. That was accidental because they had a glass tube for the vacuum tube. I mean, they could easily well have had a metal tube and probably would not have discovered this concept, at least for a few years. The concept of alternate gradient focusing, the story is like this. These two guys were in the team. They were mathematicians, by the way, Courant and Schneider, who were working on the team which was involved in the Cosmotron. Cosmotron was this accelerator whose picture we just saw as an advertisement of some company, if you remember, when we were discussing synchrotrons. The Cosmotron design had magnets of this type, which we saw earlier also. These C-shaped kind of magnets. Okay. And the point of the problem which was happening was that when they fabricated the magnets and brought it to the Cosmotron to assemble, they found that they could not fit those magnets close to each other, because the magnets were having some kind of crosstalk, that is, either ka magnetic field udhar ka magnetic field ko affect kar raha hai. And one possible solution which the engineering team came up with was saying that for half of the magnet, let us have the C shape on the outer side of the beam line, and for the other half, let us have the C shape on the inside of the beam line. If you can't visualize this, don't worry about it. Basically, what they are saying is that if this is the beam line, it's a circular beam line, the magnets are placed like this. Okay, so that the vertical arm of the C is on the inner side of the beam line, and the opening of the C, this region, is on the outer side of the beam line. So they found that they have to rearrange this. The engineering team came up with this solution: rearrange the magnet so that alternative magnets aisa rahega. half of them with the iron arm of the sea inside, and the other half with the iron arm of the sea outside. Uh, Something like this. This is a C-shaped magnet. Place it alternative. I am demonstrating this on my video. Okay. Next magnet like this. Instead of all the magnets like this, same orientation. They said ऐसा किसी को अंदर side से ले लो, बाहर side से ले लो, like that. That is what they were proposing. The engineering team was proposing this. And since these guys were the calculation experts, they were told by the boss, अरे यार ऐसा उल्टा फुल्टा करेगा तो कुछ होगा क्या देखो, means will the beam be stable. So Courant and Schneider took up the calculation. They did the calculation and they reported back saying that, boss, according to our calculation, if we do this ulta arrangement, the beam stability is actually improved according to our calculation. So the boss was very surprised. He said, do it again, and so on and so forth. Finally, they found that actually, at least the mathematical prediction is that the beam quality is improving when you do this alternate arrangement of the magnets, which was an extremely surprising result. No one really understood what is going on. But then the Cosmotron obviously was assembled that way, because anyway assembling it in the original design way was not possible. That was what caused this problem in the first place. And after assembly, when they ran the Cosmotron, they actually found that the calculation is right, that the beam stability is actually significantly improved. And Courant and Schneider then decided that let us patent this particular concept. And when they went to patent it, they found that this is already a patented concept by another scientist called Christophilos, who was a Greek engineer. Christophilos had looked at Oliphant's work and he had proposed this concept. Of course, it was largely ignored when he had proposed it. And then he quietly quit his job in regular engineering and went to join a lift company somewhere. And he was repairing elevators or lifts for that company. That was his regular job. Then one day he came to USA for something, and then he met Blewett, which is one of another big name in accelerators in the US. And Blewett then told him that Courant and Schneider had actually done, they had tried to do, and actually you have the patent and so on. Then he came and discussed, and then he gradually joined the US scientific community, and he did lot of interesting work, Christophilos. But Christophilos had already done this work in 1950s. And in 1958, Courant and Schneider rediscovered this, and they found that when you rearrange this magnet, it works differently. Finally, they figured out how it actually works out. Basically, they found that the magnet, because of the C-shaped yoke, it is not acting as a pure dipole magnet. It has higher order, means you can expand it as a Taylor series in dipole plus quadrupole plus octopole and so on. And they found that it was the quadrupole term which is actually helping to focus the beam. And because of that focusing, the beam is behaving much more stable, and you are getting very good beam currents and beam transport and so on. That led to a revolution where deliberately people started manufacturing these quadrupole magnets and adding them in the beam line, and they found that this gives a very significant amount of stability. And the whole of transverse beam dynamics, that is beam dynamics in the perpendicular direction to the beam transport, started developing from this particular stage. So basically, quadrupole magnets or even electrostatic quadrupoles are now the de facto components in any accelerator beam transport system. Any accelerator you find, you will usually find a quadrupole for the focusing of the beam, because it has become a standard. Basically, a quadrupole, the role of a quadrupole in a beam transport is like the role of a lens in optical transport. So basically, the arrival of the quadrupole on the accelerator scene can be equated to the arrival of lens in the scene of optics. You know that the lens invention of the lens basically revolutionized optics. You could do a number of things which you could never do earlier. Same way, the quadrupole magnet actually impacted the field of accelerators and ion beam transport in general, and it became a permanent fixture in all accelerator systems after its original discovery in the 1950s. Okay. So with these two important concepts, one is phase stability and one is what you call as strong focusing or alternate gradient focusing. So Macmillan had already discovered a weak kind of focusing in the cyclotron. We briefly discussed this when we were discussing the cyclotron, and that was called weak focusing. And to distinguish that from the quadrupole focusing, the alternate gradient focusing came to be called as strong focusing, because you get a significant amount of focusing effect from the quadrupole magnetic field. And with these two developments, basically the conceptual development of accelerators is completed in somewhere in the 1960s. Whatever we are studying right now is a application of the same concepts to more and more different scenarios. That's all. Okay. So our whole course is structured around these ideas: uh, AC acceleration, phase stability, and strong focusing. The three major modules of beam physics. Transverse dynamics is entirely dealt with in terms of the alternate gradient or strong focusing. Longitudinal dynamics, that is dynamics of the beam in the direction of the transport, is entirely dealt with in the context of phase stability. And the acceleration of the beam or beam acceleration is entirely dealt with in terms of the concept of AC acceleration through a RF cavity or a waveguide. Okay. So these concepts of AC acceleration, phase stability, and strong focusing are the basic guiding aspects which we will use to study different aspects of beam dynamics. That will be after we finish some introductory material in the next few lectures. We'll be going forward for that. Okay. Just to complete the story, two things which we spoke about. One was the radio frequency quadrupole. This is a photograph of such an object. Basically, it merges the concept of a quadrupole field with the concept of a LINAC. You can see that there are 4 poles over here, and each pole actually is not a smooth one, but actually has some kind of groove type structure. If you can see this carefully, comb like or groove like structure. And basically what this achieves is that because you have these grooves, as you travel along the axis of this object, the beam experiences something similar to what it would experience in a LINAC. In the LINAC, basically it experiences a conductor close by shielding it, and then an open region where it accelerates, and again close by shielding it, open region where it accelerates. That kind of physical situation is simulated for the ion when it travels through this. And the quadrupole nature of this keeps focusing the beam also. So you have got acceleration along the axis of this, because the field configuration is like a LINAC, because of the modulation on each of these vanes, they are called, or each of these poles, quadrupoles. And the polarity of the quadrupoles keeps switching, which keeps basically focusing the beam. So a radio frequency quadrupole basically merges a LINAC structure with a quadrupole structure so that it focuses and accelerates the beam. And if you input a DC beam into this, it also bunches the beam. So it is bunching, focusing, and accelerating, all these things together. So it is a merger of all the 3 things which we talked about: longitudinal dynamics, which is bunching of the beam at a particular phase, focusing of the beam, but that is strong focusing of the beam by the quadrupole, and acceleration of the beam because of simulating the structure like a LINAC structure. Okay. We'll be coming to this in detail at late stage of this course, but basically I wanted to just give you this idea that all these three concepts can be merged together: bunching, focusing, and acceleration. And the RFQ, the radio frequency quadrupole, actually achieves this in a technological context. The other important innovative idea which came about is the free electron laser, which basically works in the following manner. You have an electron beam which is traveling. Let me bring my cursor back. You have an electron beam which is traveling through a bending magnet. So while the electron is experiencing bending, basically it will be going to emit synchrotron radiation. But before it manages to start emitting synchrotron radiation, if you input a particular wavelength of your choice, then it turns out that bulk of the radiation emitted by the electron is coherent with the input radiation. This is compared with a regular laser. You have a energy reservoir which is optically pumped. An optically pumped medium is basically a medium which is just going to emit. Abhi emit karne wala hai. And at that point of time, you input a particular wavelength, then that wavelength gets amplified. Here the concept is same. The electron beam is bending through this bending magnet, and therefore it is about to emit radiation. At that moment, if you input an incident wave, then all the emission is coherent with that incident wave, and you get stimulated emission of radiation. And sorry, the advantage for this is, since the synchrotron radiation is a broadband source, you can incident any given wavelength and that will get amplified. So you can get a free electron laser which operates, which can act as a laser source right from microwaves to X-rays, infrared, ultraviolet, anything of your choice. You can get any wavelength of your choice. So if you have a experiment where you need a microwave laser and a X-ray laser, then a free electron laser can do both the things for you. So it's an amazing technological conceptual development, and followed up by actual technology. There are many free electron lasers which operate at synchrotron facilities worldwide. It's an amazing concept. Okay. So this basically brings us to a close as far as this history of accelerators is concerned. The tracks through this, if you can check, DC accelerators are shown in red. AC accelerators are all shown in orange. LINAC in particular is shown in green. All circular AC accelerators which are based on AC acceleration, three different types basically: cyclotron, microtron, and synchrotron. They are all shown in orange, and further developments on these types of accelerators are all shown in orange, including phase stability, strong focusing, etc. Induction based accelerator track is shown in blue because that is only the ray transformer, and Kirst, how he managed to actually create that particular accelerator, the Betatron. Okay. This basically brings me to a close as far as our this particular lecture is concerned. This is what I wanted to say. I would definitely like to have your view on this, or your inputs, or your feedback on this. Okay. I'll stop the recording now and we can discuss some more if required.